Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and today we're returning to my series on deck building for Arkham Horror the card game. First, a quick recap from the last video. We talked about what the game asks you to do in terms of clue discovery and enemy management, and how building a team should be reflective of the roles needed to win. The trick, of course, is getting the right balance across the sum of all of your investigators. What role or roles you need to fill should inform your investigator choice, and what investigator you choose should inform how you're going to perform your role or roles on the team. All of that, of course, informs deck building and vice versa. I don't really view these as separate steps in deck building. Instead, they're all happening somewhat simultaneously. If there's a card that you really want to play, maybe you don't need to force it into the investigator you've already chosen. Maybe go back and pick someone else to play. And that brings us to today's video, which is all about investigator choice. What makes these investigators unique? And what do their abilities tell us about what role they can perform on a team? Now, let's answer those questions by looking at what the design team's philosophy is for creating investigator cards. I'll be referencing here a blog post by the lead designer, MJ Newman, from several years ago, but I think you'll find that there's a lot of insights to be gleaned from her best practices even today. So first, MJ talks about how while Arkham Horror the card game is all about playing a deck, the investigator card is separated from the deck for a key reason. The investigator card serves as your deck's identity. And this identity restricts which cards you can put into your deck by giving you interesting restrictions to that giant card pool that we have, but also allowing you to focus on particular kinds of cards so you don't get lost in the enormous number of options available, especially when taking advantage of the investigator's special ability. Finally, the investigator really is you, the player, your way of interacting with the game and its world. Yes, we sometimes take very mechanical actions like drawing cards or gaining resources, but movement, investigating, fighting, all of these are actions that we imagine our chosen character is doing in the story of the scenario. Let's next take a bit more of a look at the anatomy of an investigator card. What makes each of these investigator cards unique? The front side of the card has a line of those four skills: willpower, intellect, combat, and agility. They have numbers that are assigned to each, denoting how we will interact with skill tests in the game. Usually, these numbers add up to 12. Having higher or lower numbers can tell you at a glance that the investigator is good at something or not so good at something. So it immediately begs the question of how we take advantage of these numbers, or avoid using these numbers. Now, below this is a text box. Investigators have one or more separate abilities here, which may or may not be the focus of your deck. It might be the first thing that you read when you see a new investigator, so it better be kind of cool, right? It might attract you to playing that investigator the first time you look at it. Below, you get an elder sign. This ability and modifier is what happens when you draw the token during a skill test. While the elder sign isn't particularly common in the game, maybe 1 out of 16 to 20 times that you draw a token, it is a point of excitement. You draw the token, you think, what cool thing happens now? Finally, at the bottom are some numbers indicating how much damage and horror the investigator can take before they are defeated. On the back side of the investigator card is a set of deck building rules. While I don't think the deck building rules can be easily divorced from discussion about the front side of the card, I'm going to do just that in this video. I want to save discussion about the types of deck building for a future video. So we won't be talking about them anymore, but let me clarify to say that deck building rules is separate from the concept of what cards should I include in my deck, which we still will talk about extensively today. Okay, so ideally, all of these features of an investigator are unique to them and not repeated across investigators, but with 70 plus investigators officially released by the design team, some things, like the stat line in particular, have been shared, and other things are quite similar. Still, with so many investigators, it's amazing that all of them still feel different. So, how do the designers do it? MJ cites 5 best practices when designing an investigator card. An investigator should fill at least one role. Investigators should fill a space that other investigators don't. Their ability should inform deck building, their ability should be thematic, and finally, they should be cool. We'll be focusing on 2 of these today, which should be no surprise as a bridge between the last video and future videos. They should fill at least one role, and their ability should serve as a guide for deck building. As MG says in her article, usually we want to craft an investigator in such a way to guide them towards a particular role, to really cement their identity and make deck building a little less obtuse for players. I'm going to do just that with you today. The rest of the video will show you how to analyze an investigator's ability and how it fits into your team role or roles, as well as your deck itself. So let's get started. So why is your investigator ability so important? Because it's like a permanent card. I know it goes without saying, but your ability is there from the very beginning of the game. You don't need to draw out of 30 plus cards in your deck. You don't need to spend any actions or resources to get into play, and you'll never lose it either. Well, never say never on that one. So what does that do for you in your deck building? There are 4 more or less basic possibilities. First, if your investigator has it already, maybe you don't need whatever it gives you in your deck as well. So take a look at Zoe Samaris's ability. She gets a resource for every time she becomes engaged with an enemy. That's potentially a lot of extra resources over the course of a whole scenario. If you're playing Zoe, you might consider running fewer cards that just gain resources in your deck. Go ahead and take out that boring emergency cache and run something else that you now have space for in the deck. That's an option at least. But the flip side is that maybe you can use your ability to enhance the identity of your deck. That is, if your ability does something, maybe your deck should do that same thing even more. Take Ursula Downs. Her ability is to gain an extra investigate action after she moves. That's cool on its own because scenarios want you to move fairly often. But hey, what if my deck is built around ensuring that I'm moving every single round? Maybe a simpler answer. Going back to Zoe from a second ago, we said that her ability could mean that I don't need to run as many resource generating cards, but it could also mean that your cards can be on average more expensive instead. Now the extra resources aren't just a nice bonus, but rather a crucial part of how I win the game. Next, some abilities are a little more complicated in how they interact with your deck since they do something a bit more specific. Let's look at Roland Banks for a minute. His ability is to discover a clue after you defeat an enemy. Again, a lot of investigators are interested in defeating enemies. That's the whole idea of a fighter role. And getting clues is a nice bonus. But Roland might look at his card pool to look at specific cards that work better when enemies are around, or if clues are on locations, or potentially cards that trigger after clues are discovered. There are certain packages of cards or archetypes that some investigators are begging you to play given what their abilities are. Now, it's not to say you must play these archetypes. There are certainly other reasons to play an investigator, but if you really want to see the whole investigator shine, it's a good place to start. Finally, some investigator abilities tell you that you can break the usual rules of deck building composition. Silas Marsh is a great example. His ability lets him return a skill card he committed to his hand if he no longer needs it to pass the test. Note that you're only allowed to do this with skill cards. Other cards you may commit aren't eligible. It's essentially a restricted version of card draw, leaving his hand full of skill cards on most turns. This means that coupled with his signature cards, Silas has good reason to run far more skill cards than the usual investigator. It's not so strange for him to have 20 skills, rather than the typical 6 to 8 or 10 or so. Some other investigators are like this too, where they may run a higher than usual density of a card type, like Nathaniel Cho and events, or cards with a particular trait or text, like Daisy Walker and tomes. Now, beyond how they inform deck building, the abilities themselves tend to be classified into one of the following types. Extra actions, where investigator gets an extra action each round of a specific type or restricted in some other way. Relatedly, some investigators get an ability that gives a strong automatic effect, usually what typically is the result of a skill test, like dealing damage or discovering a clue. Next, some investigators' abilities simply help them, or others, pass skill tests more easily in some way. And finally, many investigators have built-in economy. Their ability assists them by gaining extra resources or reducing resource costs, or by drawing extra cards. As we go through some examples of all of these, we'll note that many investigators actually combine a few of these ability types together, and that makes for some very powerful investigators. It's also worth saying here that sometimes these abilities are not found on the investigator card itself, but rather on a permanent signature asset. It's basically the same idea as an investigator card, but the designer needed an extra card to make the ability work. Also, sometimes there'll be some related abilities on the investigator's signature cards, which are going to be found inside the deck instead. Okay, first one up is extra actions. Extra actions are great in this game. They allow you to do a little bit more each round than you otherwise could do, and that can make all the difference in winning a scenario. Finn Edwards gets an extra action to evade. Marie gets an extra action to use spells as long as she has Doom on one of her cards, and Skids gets an extra action to do whatever, but you'll have to pay for it. These are all pretty straightforward, but there are some hidden extra actions in the form of action compression in the next few investigators. William York gets to play an asset from his discard pile after he defeats an enemy. It's strong recursion, yes, but it's also just an extra action to play an asset. For Marion Tavares, it's much the same thing. She has an extra action to play an event under some circumstances. And she does get some extra card draw baked in too, which is nice. And the same goes with Tony Morgan. He gets an extra action to fight or engage, and while it's not on his card itself, it's on one of those permanent assets I was talking about before, but he does get paid one resource for defeating enemies with a bounty on him as well. Next, let's look at those automatic effects I was talking about earlier. Roland's ability, we saw before, but it's worth pointing out how strong straight-up clue discovery is. You get to bypass any negatives to investigating, like a high shroud value or a locked door. Agnes Baker also gets to deal damage without thinking about the restrictions of fighting enemies. The horror is a downside, but it's one of those abilities that really makes you think about your deck. How can I make my ability happen whenever I want? What kind of horror healing can I put in to make this happen all scenario long? And finally, we have Rita Young's ability, which is to deal damage or move after evading an enemy. Again, a very nice way to deal damage without fighting. Now, there's a few investigators whose whole ability is just that they're better at passing skill tests. We haven't talked too much about investigator stat lines yet, but investigators who don't have lopsided stat lines might just need the help to pass tests at all. The odds of passing are better for Jim Culver, who turns the modifier on skull tokens into zeros. For Kate Winthrop, she can get a +2 skill value for each clue she's able to put on a science or tool asset. All that text is on a different card entirely. Don't worry about it. And then Daryl Simmons works the other way around. Instead of getting +2, he reduces the difficulty of a skill test by 2. And that one works not just for him, but for anyone else at his location as well. Doing better at skill tests really takes all shapes and forms. Calvin Wright can get large skill values across the board, but he needs to be on death's doorstep to do it. Wendy Adams has some chaos bag manipulation built in. If she draws a token that she doesn't like, she can just discard a card to try again and draw a new token. And hey, that definitely helps you pass a skill test. While these abilities are all fine, good even, the reality is that every investigator needs to pass skill tests somehow. So as an ability, you need a little bit more than this. So let's look at Mark Harrigan, who, with Sophie, is able to take direct damage to not only get +2 to a skill test, but also draw a card from his deck. It's a skill boost, but with a little bit of economy built in. Which brings us to talking about economy. Again, this is either related to resources or cards. Jenny Barnes has a very, very simple ability, 1 extra resource every round, no questions asked. Amina Zidane can play an asset at a 3 resource discount every round, but it comes into play with a Doom. And Wilson Richards, he gets a 1 resource discount on a tool once per round. You might have noticed that all 3 of these investigators have an all 3 stat line, So they might have some extra cash floating around. They're going to need it to help them pass tests. Hey, we're missing an important second ability on Wilson's card. He also gets a +1 skill value while using tools. Next up, these Seekers all have some extra card draw built in. Harvey Walters, over there on the right, is almost like Jenny. He gets an extra card every round. Well, that's a little bit more complicated than that. The other two have a pseudo card in hand. For Norman Withers, he can play the top card of his deck at a -1 resource discount. For Joe Diamond, it's an event on the top of his hunt deck, played at a -2 resource discount. Again, it's as if the card were in their hand, so if they don't use their ability, it's not really an extra card draw that round. You can see so far that we have a lot of abilities that are just slight variations of each other. So it's easy to see not just the relative balance, but the ways that those differences between similar abilities actually result in quite different decks. You could say that Jenny and Wilson are very similar because they both get an extra resource every round, but Wilson's extra resource is contingent upon having a tool in hand that he wants to play, whereas Jenny can stockpile her resources round after round. Kate Winthrop and Daryl Simmons both get +2 to skill tests, kind of. Daryl's test difficulty reduction really results in an entirely different archetype. Not every investigator's abilities can be summed up quite as easily as what we've seen so far. Let's check out Patrice Hathaway. Her ability is to discard her whole hand and draw back up to 5. It's not really card draw in the same sense as Harvey's at all, but she sure sees a lot of her deck each scenario. To compensate, her stat line is severely impaired. Her total is 10 instead of the usual 12. Amanda Sharp's stat line is even worse, all 2s across the board. Her ability is a bit hard to understand at first. She draws an extra card, but gets to use a skill card over and over again, up to the number of skill tests that she takes. It's incredibly powerful, especially so as her skill cards get better. Her ability is some weird combination between economy and skill tests, but the real power is in whatever the effect is of the skill card she's chosen to use this round. Then there's Father Mateo, who kind of has a little bit of everything. He can avoid the autofail once per game. That's a little bit of helping pass tests. And when he draws the Elder Sign, which he's trying to do, he can either draw a card and gain a resource, which is economy, or get another extra action, which is another extra action. The whole package is very nice, but it requires a lot out of your deck to make sure this happens more than every once in a blue moon. So after all that, which types of abilities are best? It's very hard to evaluate this in a vacuum since investigators are complex beings, but getting extra actions is unambiguously good. Other kinds of action compression is also very good because you're likely to build to use it as much as possible. Decks generally need action compression as it is, so getting it right from the get-go on your investigator card is excellent. By comparison, just getting help passing skill tests is much less valuable. Decks need to do this already, but it's generally easier and cheaper to do so with cards in your deck. After all, committing cards in your hand to a test costs nothing. Finally, while extra resource generation is nice, actionless card draw is incredibly good, because getting access to more of your deck more quickly unlocks even more potential of your deck. It is a card game after all, and cards are good. As a last exercise, let's look at 2 investigators and their whole kit. Investigator card, and both the signature card and signature weaknesses. I'm going to talk through how I analyzed the questions from earlier, first with Bob Jenkins, and then with Daniela Reyes, both from the Edge of the Earth Investigator expansion. So, Bob Jenkins has an ability to get an extra action each round to play an item asset from his hand, or from someone else's hand. He can also help pay for it. This is obviously an extra action ability, with some restrictions. He's got a stat line of 2 willpower, 4 intellect, 3 combat, 3 agility. His signature card, if he finds and plays it, adds in a bit of economy to the mix, and adds the ability to share items around the table for investigators who might not otherwise be able to include them in their decks. Finally, his weakness simply punishes him for not holding on to very much money. So, the questions we've been talking about all video. First, which roles can this investigator play? Bob is fairly open. His ability leans him to a support role, and his stat line allows him to investigate with above average success, but he could easily play weapons and pass tests fighting enemies. How does his ability inform deck building? Well, it's all about those items. Those extra actions to play items might be all he needs for action compression for at least part of the campaign, or he could play rogue cards like Haste and Payday that reward him from taking extra actions, or use Eon Chart to convert those play actions into investigates. He'll certainly want to look at specific cards that synergize with his ability, like Schaffner's Catalog, and in fact, he probably wants to have more than the average number of items in the deck, especially cheap ones that he could play at any time, under anyone's control. And lastly, he should keep his weakness in mind. Either he'll be encouraged to play big money to hoard resources until he sees his weakness, or he should run extra horror healing or sanity soak. And now, let's move on to Daniela Reyes. Her ability reads, after an enemy attacks you, accept an attack of opportunity you provoked, even if that attack was cancelled, either deal 1 damage to that enemy or automatically evade it. This is a strong automatic effect. You'll note that it doesn't even specify non-elite enemies. Now her stat line is quite lopsided. 4 willpower, 1 intellect, 5 combat, 2 agility. Her signature card is a tool that's used to get enemies to attack her and then can be used to fight them back. Her weakness, Mob Goons, is a big enemy that deals its damage and horror as direct. Okay, the questions again. What role can this investigator play? Everything about Daniela says fighter, but she can lean into support by protecting others from getting attacked or taking damage. She'll just probably be the one tanking instead. The ability informs deck building in a number of ways, mostly through the synergistic cards portion. While her ability does deal extra damage on its own, it's likely not enough, and she'll want to lean into this ability by using cards like Guard Dog and Toe to Toe, as well as her wrench. And given her weakness, she'll need ways to cancel or heal damage, as well as have some traditional soak. She doesn't bend any deck building guidelines really. You'll still want a healthy mix of weapons, events, and skills. Okay, well, to wrap up, here's what we've learned today. We've seen that investigator choice gives direction to deck building and team composition. Identifying what your ability is and how it contributes is key. A less focused ability requires a bit more out of you and your deck building. Think about what your ability does and doesn't do, and then the rest of your deck will have to compensate. That said, investigators still can be played many different ways, especially based on your team's needs. The front of the investigator card is just part of the story. Next time, we'll take a look at the back of the investigator card to focus on deck building rules. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.